And now we have time for questions. Those questions could be directed towards me or to the members of Waterford, their wonderful system, naming system.
Well,
I wish I had a question. I don't have a question, except I would just like to say this is one of the most marvelous real collaborations I've seen in arts and sciences, and it's just beautiful.
Perhaps we could bring the lights up a little bit to make it easier. See someone over there, yeah.
A while back, I remember reading about the neuroscientific studies that they're doing, showing the vestigial purposes of music in the brain. It actually gives pleasure. You know, they've actually been able to measure, and those of us who sing in choral groups can attest to how good one feels afterwards. And it's not just feel good. It's an actual measurable, apparently.
Yes, I think so, and I wouldn't call it vestigial. I think that it's some of the studies. There's a number of theories. One theory is sort of a theory of sexual selection. You might have know about a book by my colleague Jeffrey Miller called The Mating Mind, which tries to explain music and many other aspects of the arts as more or less a sexual display, instead of the whole world like Jimi Hendrix. It turns out that explains some, but by no means all, aspect of music in the arts. How could it explain lullabies? How could it explain the musical way that mothers talk to their infants? And when you look at music in an ancestral context, you don't have to go very far back, and still today, to find that music is most often performed in the context of groups. And not only does it provide a sense of we-ness, but it also coordinates groups. And this is, I think, one of the great assets of thinking about a human group as like a single organism. There must be this kind of coordination of mood, for example. And what does music do? It invoke mood. What would military music do, or peace music do? You need to get everyone in the group on the same page. And that includes their emotional basis, including their psychological basis. And so right away, music goes from being something inexplicable to something that's being truly part of the anatomy and physiology of the group. And that can be taken in so many wonderful directions.
Could you stand when you do your question so that it helps the group, or you can repeat the question, David? That'd be great.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So we've all heard of cases where someone, often by some extreme emotional event, changes their personality from introvert to extrovert and so on. How does that figure into the context of what you're talking about?
Well, this is...
Did you guys read that there? Don't have to repeat it.
So let me see if I can repeat it. We all know people that have been changed, basically transformed by the events of their lives, have changed their personalities. And how can we understand this from an evolutionary perspective? Is that safe to say? All these questions are complicated, and therefore my answer will be inadequate. But what we need to reconcile is, in the first place, a very strong heritable component to our personalities. And you don't need a scientist to tell you this. Just ask any parent of 2 or more children. Are they different out of the box? Yes. So there are big differences among people out of the box, but everyone is also flexible and needs to be flexible. And one of the things that evolution tells you, and this is true for all creatures, is that it's never adaptive to just have a set of instructions that says do this. We always need to be tailoring our behaviors to the environment. And all organisms have the capacity to do this to a degree. Humans more than any other. And one of many stories that I could tell, my colleague Grant Soloway, who wrote a book called Born to Rebel about birth order from an evolutionary perspective. Basically, he has a theory of single families as a multiple niche environment in which, with every sibling, just like the bush babies that I talked about, more or less can take up one niche, and then other individuals have to take up other niches. And in order to do that, you need to have flexibility. need to be able to tailor your behavior to your immediate environment, not just your family environment, but your wider social environment. And you know, when what you're doing isn't working, and you don't have the slightest idea why, you're just desperate. Wouldn't it be nice to have a conversion event? And just pick up another set of beliefs and practices? And religions are very good at doing that for us. So here we get a sense of the power of culture. And I think what's so exciting is that you can have a sophisticated concept of genetic influences and an equally sophisticated concept of cultural influences, which go together and are both very powerful. Way in the back there. Could you stand up?
Yes, you spoke about the eyes being uniquely and physically,
Right, the eyes.
Right. So you must have a lot to say about the ears.
I do, and as a jack of all trades covering all of these subjects, it means that I'm not a master of all of them. So I can't tell you much specifically about the ears. I mean, it is certainly true that our sensitivity to human speech and so on is very, very highly evolved. But I think the main thing I want to bring out, this isn't dodging your question, I think it's generalizing it a bit, is how much, once we begin to evolve as team players, and we develop our minds in different ways than our primate ancestors. And it's not a matter of, we often think of intelligence as being a linear scale, so we're the smartest, and then chimps are the next smartest, and so no, it's not like that at all. The particular skills that are adapted to teamwork are not that difficult. They simply didn't evolve in other species because they didn't have the background of trust. And a good example of that is pointing. What could be simpler than pointing? I point, and everyone knows what it means. Well, it turns out, according to current research, is that apes are dumbfounded by what it means to point, because that requires a shared awareness that I know what you want, and I care enough in order to point it out to you, which does not exist in ape society. Now, what animal does understand the meaning of pointing? Dogs. Dogs and wolves. Wolves are dumbfounded by pointing also. And the only reason that dogs know what it's like to point is not because they were raised in captivity, because you can raise wolves in captivity and they're still dumbfounded. No, it was a period of genetic evolution taking place over a period of 130,000 years or so by our best estimate that brought another species into cooperative human society. And then they evolved to know that if they have a problem, someone else might have a solution. You might want to look their way. Sir.
Yeah, excuse me. Traditionally, I think we used to learn that man was somehow unique in many of his characteristics, but the biologists have taught us now that much of this is a question of degree. For example, chimps communicate, we know elephants communicate. And I was wondering if the evolutionary biologists have come up with any examples, or looking for an example, frankly, of where human beings may be in fact unique and not just a question of degree in terms of our emotions or consciousness. If you understand the question.
Yes, I do. In what ways are humans unique, if any? And in so many ways they're not unique. So I think that part of what makes this such a wonderful collection of stories is that throughout history we prided ourselves on being unique, uniquely intelligent, uniquely moral, uniquely aesthetic, unique in our wonderful personalities. And it is so interesting time and time again to discover actually deep continuity. And I think that's especially the case with the issues that we regard as moral. It's sheer hubris to think that we're a more moral species than others. But yet, there's also a sense in which we are unique. And my colleague Terry Deacon wrote a book called The Symbolic Species, which I encourage all of you to read. But basically says that we are unique in our capacity for symbolic thought. And what is symbolic thought? If I were to train a mouse to, if I gave a mouse some cheese and said the word cheese and did that often enough, it would associate the word with the cheese. Okay, so it's paired these two things. But then if I stopped giving it cheese and kept saying the word cheese, it would stop associating them. That's what associative learning is. But if I were to say the word cheese to you 1,000,000 times, you might feel like snapping me, but you would still associate the word with the concept. And that's what symbolic thought is. It's mental associations which have a life of their own, which can become different than the environmental associations. And it was Terry's genius, I think, to realize that this is something which actually isn't necessarily so difficult. The question is, why would it be an advantage for anyone? And so what makes us unique is not the fact that we have unique mental abilities to begin with, but we find ourselves in this environmental situation in which symbolic thought might be useful. And the really stunning thing about his thesis is that because symbolic thought isn't necessarily complex, it's just usually not useful, Terry says, well, maybe we can teach other species to think symbolically, more like us than their own kind. And this would not be a matter of discovering the inscrutable ways that animals think. This would be really like getting a bear to ride a bicycle in order to think in a new way. Can we bring any other species across the threshold and actually have them think symbolically like us? And if any of you are knowledgeable about this, you know that the answer is actually yes. Kanzi the bonobo and Alex, the African gray parrot, can actually talk to us in our own way. Back there?
Following up on this, what about the difference between experiential learning and symbolic learning and the extension of knowledge through symbolic?
Well, all of these things have to be communicated, and I mentioned it very briefly in my talk, but I think it's a point well worth making, that all of the forms of thought that are most characteristic of humans, even if they're not unique, are fundamentally communal. They really regard a sense in which we can be with social partners that we trust. And this also gives me an opportunity to talk a bit more about cultural evolution, because cultural evolution can be profound in its consequences. Just because it's cultural doesn't make it any less profound. And there's a wonderful book by Walter Long called Morality and Literacy about the effect of the written word as a momentous event in cultural evolution. Because before we could write stuff down, everything that was known had to be remembered and passed from head to head. And that was such a huge constraint on human thought that it prevented us from doing all kinds of things. And once we were able to write things down and to download some of this information, we could use our minds for things that they had never been used for in the past. And this more or less corresponds to the revolution of thinking that occurred basically during the time of the Greeks. And so society as we know it, with all of its shared aspects and the scale of human society, probably required that cultural invention.
Take that way over there.
Yes,
There's a
yes.
question for the musicians, actually.
Great.
I'm very curious to know, since you played through from individual bits in a whole to a cooperative piece, whether you have a certain leaning toward the individual over the cooperative or vice versa.
You mean which we liked better?
Yes.
Okay, so did we like the individual or the more cooperative plan? So do you mean in terms of the soloing?
The soloing, the first piece was dramatically different from the third piece, and
Yes.
of course the interesting bits of the second piece. I'm just curious to know which one appealed
Okay.
more.
I like the group soloing quite a lot. But you know, I don't know if I had to choose, like what would I choose? In the first incarnation of Water Bear, we played basically, we never said who was going to ever be taking a solo. And so we would just launch into the piece, and whoever seemed to be taking solo, maybe we'd let them and maybe we wouldn't. So we basically treated it it as we're just going to improvise and let's see what happens. And if someone's playing something really great, then maybe you'd let it come through. And if someone wasn't, then maybe you'd play over them. And this was really a fascinating way of doing it. So, but the thing you miss, and that I started to miss as a composer, was I would write a certain part, but I would never necessarily hear it. So in order to hear what I wrote, I had to say, well, now for this part, I'd like us to play this exact thing right here, put some rules to it. And the other benefit of hearing one person solo at a time is that then you get to really hear that person solo. You get to really hear what they're bringing. And there's times when, I just love the sound of instruments. And so I would be like, oh, I want to hear the cello. Chris, play, Or Nate also plays guitar, and the same about piano. So, does anyone else you guys have a preference?
I would say that, one of the things that makes a musician is someone who has a tendency toward cooperation and collaboration, and that's what's exciting about music to me, is when you get together and do something. So, to me, the solos are just more, I guess, a tradition that we seem to be following. But the interesting part is just getting together to play.
I would also say that when one person's soloing, the other people are contributing to the whole at the same time. That person is like shining a little brighter than the others, but the others have an important role to cooperate and support that person. And when we're doing a group solo, we're all supporting each other equally, we're listening to each other. There's not a great deal of difference in my book between us, individual solo and a group solo, because we're always having to support each other and listen to each other, and that's one of the neat things about music. And I was thinking about music and perhaps lots of other things we do in life allow a shy person to be bold, because we're playing this, we're hiding behind our instrument and we're able to be brash, and I could get up and do that solo.
Unbelievable to see them do that.